very happy to be in this panel. I think that the papers are going to work really nicely together, and particularly I think this follows on quite nicely from what Robbie has just been talking about. This paper is part of I'm coming to the end of my first year of PhD research, which, as everyone in this position will say, that's really scary to already be a year in. And my research is all about 21st century design for Shakespeare, specifically Jacobethanism, which is my jargon word, and that essentially is just the words Elizabethan and Jacobean smushed together. That's all it means. So this paper is what I've been working on to date, which is kind of the prologue to 21st century design of what's come before in order to better understand what's happening now. The period of Shakespeare's lifetime has long proven popular as an onstage setting for the playwright's works. Versions of Elizabethan and Jacobean, or Jacobethan, dress, reconstructions of early modern playing places, and the appropriation of specific symbols and icons associated with the period have long formed key components of design for Shakespeare, and that this is across the centuries since the plays were first performed. The way in which this period has been represented visually has changed significantly over time, however, as has the reason for following this approach to design in the first place. In this paper, I analyse variations in the use of Jacobethan aesthetics when setting Shakespeare's plays in the period of his lifetime to point towards wider changes in the cultural significance of the playwright and his works. I'll argue that these developments in Jacobethanism were key components in the development of Shakespeare's reputation as national poet, the construction of English national identity, and ongoing quests to retrieve and locate an authentic Shakespeare. So I'll start by briefly outlining the notion of setting as a framework within which these variations can actually be analysed. In the context of performance, the term setting refers to the time, the place, and the environment in which a creative team chooses to contextualise a play for the purposes of a particular production. So if we consider that performance is a process of cultural negotiation through which works have a continued existence, as has been suggested by W.B. Worthen, and that the visual cues communicating a production's setting provide a guide to its intended social and cultural significance, this element of design can be read to reveal developments in the cultural significance of the works and their author. So a production team can select any one of these four categories as a starting point for creating an onstage setting. The time of the author, any time specified within the text, the time in which the play is being performed, or an alternative time. So to give you an example of how that might actually manifest, we'll look at Julius Caesar as an example. So the play could be staged in early modern dress. It was written in 1599, we believe. This was a production that happened at the Globe in 1999, shortly after it first opened. It could be staged in togas. It's set in ancient Rome, and this is what's currently being staged at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon. It could be staged in modern dress, as has controversially been the case at the Public Theatre in New York, which we could talk about in the question time, as it's such a big issue at the moment. Alternatively, it could be set in the year 4000 AD, and this was a production that was set on a spaceship called Roma, which was orbiting the planet Europa, and it was staged in Houston in February last year. So there are all these different options just as a starting point. And the category of setting selected at this point can reveal what's seen to be the contemporary significance of a particular text. So each approach will highlight different themes and ideas in the play, and it can also be used to establish particular links between the text and historical or contemporary events or figures. For example, Trump. So productions rarely fit neatly into a single category, however. The setting is communicated through a complex system of visual signs, of which many elements relate specifically to the time and the place in which the production has been created. If you've looked at any period drama from the 80s, you'll probably be able to recognise quite quickly that it was made in the 80s as a result of this layering of historical and modern aesthetics that weren't necessarily intended but are nevertheless included in their design. There are an infinite number of possibilities for how a creative team might represent a specific period through stage and costume design. And for Jacobethan Shakespeare productions, identifying exactly how practitioners negotiate the gap between the period of the playwright's lifetime and the time in which they're working can point towards the contemporary cultural significance of Shakespeare and his plays, as well as indicating changing values when it comes to authenticity and wider developments in performance practice. It's useful to begin by considering how Shakespeare's plays were staged in their original performance context, as a point of comparison and to see how it all began. During Shakespeare's lifetime, players are thought to have performed wearing primarily the clothing of their period. Henslow's diary This is a page from Henslow's diary. It's a collection of papers relating to the holdings and activities of the Admiral's men. So there were two playing companies in activity when Shakespeare was working. Shakespeare was in one, and this was the other company, so it's his rivals. And this is a document which is a costume inventory written in the hand of Edward Alleyne, who was the star actor of the company and very closely linked with Henslow, who was the manager and who is the overall author of these papers. And this is one of two detailed lists of apparel owned by the playing company. This inventory contains approximately 83 items under 6 headings: cloaks, gowns, antique suits, jerkins and doublets, French hose, and Venetians. And Venetians are a kind of knee-length hose, so it's just a longer kind of legwear that was popular at the time. The items included in these inventories are of comparable styles and textiles to those worn in contemporary portraits, and to surviving examples of 16th and 17th century dress. For example, this 16th century red satin cloak, embroidered with silver and silver gilt threads, which is held in the Victoria and Albert Museum collections, closely fits Alleyne's description of a scarlet cloak laid down with silver lace and silver buttons. And this black velvet slash doublet, in this portrait from around 1567, we don't know the artist, but it was from Sweden, it could be very similar to the inventory's doublet of black velvet cut on silver tinsel, which was a style of embroidery at the time. So although these... Where's it gone? Why is it closed? No! Hang on. There isn't an off button. There will be a short interlude. Maybe it overheated.
It's just like no.
Yeah, we're done. The symposium is over. Okay, well, I'm going to talk to you while it's hopefully reloaded. It's flashing off at the moment. No, you can look on here if you want.
You can press on again.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll pop this here for now, and then you can see it very small. Yes, these aren't ideal examples because you might have noticed they're from continental Europe rather than the UK, but styles of fashion were relatively similar at the time, and also across the period of the decades that we were talking. It didn't change dramatically. So it is useful to think about this as a rough idea. Thomas Platter, a Swiss visitor to London in 1599, noted in his diary that items of clothing worn by a company of players performing the tragedy of the first emperor Julius Caesar originally formed the wardrobes of England's aristocrats. I have the quote here, but I'm going to read it to you anyways. You can listen instead of reading. He says, "The actors are most expensively costumed, for it is the English usage for eminent lords or knights at their decease to bequeath and leave almost the best of their clothes to their serving men, which it is unseemly for the latter to wear, so that they can offer them for sale for a small sum of money to the actors." Please work. This account provides evidence for two separate ideas. First, that Shakespeare's company followed costuming practices similar to those of the Admiral's men, which just essentially makes Alleyne's costume inventory useful when considering how Shakespeare's company may have dressed. The performance described by Platter is most likely to be Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. We don't have another text documented that could have also been there at the time. But second, this account reports that, hurrah, there we go, turn off that right again. The account reports that early modern players wore real clothing of the period rather than mocked-up costumes. So collectively, this evidence suggests that the characters of Shakespeare's plays were originally recognisable to the audience as members of their own society. The visual sign systems encoded within the player's clothing could be read to reveal a character's social status, origin, and occupation. An item often cited as the sole surviving piece of pictorial evidence for early modern costume practices appears to tell a different story, however. The Peacham drawing, which is cited very often, it's a depiction of a Roman scene thought to be Titus Andronicus because it's on a piece of paper with lines of text beneath. And it's thought to have been created in 1595. And this seems to depict a rather more eclectic mix of clothing. So although we do have many items of Elizabethan dress, and that's the majority of the items in here. So we have doublet and hose over here, some nice Venetians over there, knee-length hose, contemporary styles of armour, and this is an Elizabethan gown with sort of very extravagant embroidered sleeves. But this guy in the middle, who would be Titus if it is Titus Andronicus, is wearing some sort of toga, he's wearing a laurel wreath, and a particular style of sandals associated with ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So the incorporation of these visual references to an ancient Roman setting, rather than just reflecting the period of the performance, suggests that the first performances of Shakespeare's plays may have simultaneously engaged with the past and the present. It's really not advisable to draw any kind of conclusions from this image. We don't know that it actually does relate to a performance. It could be in the imagination of a reader. We don't know that it was a professional playing company. If it was a playing company, it could have been an amateur performance. And like I hinted towards, it might not even be Shakespeare or anything to do with Shakespeare at all. It could be there's a particular German adaptation of the same source material that it might relate to as well. So although it's very, very kind of hazy about using this as evidence, but we can still take this as giving us some information about what the costumes potentially did in their original context. During their first performances, the stories and issues of Shakespeare's plays were likely framed as being relevant to the context in which they were being staged. The political dangers apparent in Julius Caesar, to go back to our earlier example, would have been contextualised as originating in ancient Rome, but enacted by people who appeared as Elizabethan courtiers in fine clothing of the period. And Shakespeare's plays continued to be staged primarily in the clothing of the period in which they were being performed for almost 2 centuries. It was perfectly normal to see the Hamlets and Macbeths of the 18th century wearing frock coats and powdered wigs, and the Ophelias and Lady Macbeths wearing elaborate gowns and feathered headpieces. Fashion had changed, but the practice of setting Shakespeare's plays in the recognisable environment of the present day had not. The earliest examples of Jacobethan aesthetics being used to give Shakespeare's plays a historical setting were part of 2 distinct movements in English nationalism. And the first was not, in fact, intended for the stage. The Boydell Shakespeare Gallery opened its doors in London in 1789 as a wave of English nationalism swept the country. The 18th century had seen major developments in Shakespeare's reputation. At the beginning of the century, Shakespeare's plays had been considered old-fashioned and in need of adaptation. By the 1780s, the playwright had come to be seen as England's national poet. Actor-manager David Garrick, who you might have heard of, had stage-managed the promotion of Shakespeare to the supreme symbol of British culture. And these years also saw the beginning of a nationwide increase in historical curiosity, which really came to define a cultural movement that came to define the Victorian era. And there was also a general desire to strengthen the English identity, national identity at this point in time. John Boydell's Shakespeare Gallery was inextricably entwined with these wider movements. The gallery was intended to stimulate the development of an English school of historical painting by bringing together the literary and the visual culture of England. Rosie Dias writes that, for Boydell, the public interest and the patriotism prompted by Shakespeare made the playwright the obvious choice for the basis of a national school of painting. End quote. What was particularly significant about the gallery, however, was that it linked the national poet with the legacy of the golden age in which he lived for the very first time. Many of the paintings that had been created for the gallery reimagined moments from Shakespeare's plays in an idealised Elizabethan setting. So on the screen at the moment, on this side we have the Merry Wives of Windsor, where we have doublet and hose. This is a kind of 18th century hybrid Elizabethan dress, and we've got some nice thatched cottages in the background as well. We have Othello over here. It's quite dark, so you can't really see, but he's full on doublet and hose with a ruff as well. Desdemona's not wearing so much, but Othello's definitely carrying on the Jacobethan aesthetic there. This is Much Ado About Nothing. We've got ruffs galore, doublet and hose everywhere. This is one of a series of 7 paintings from As You Like It, which were the 7 Ages of Man, and this is The Soldier. And this one isn't the best picture, but I really like it. It's in the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust collections. They hold the original. And this is The Winter's Tale, and there's a little zoom in. This is Exit pursued by a bear in doublet and hose for the first time. And the bear is down there, and he is not wearing Jacobethan dress either. So. Antigonus is. The Boydell Shakespeare Gallery thus established a visual link between the time of the author and the content of his plays as a means of constructing a new sense of Englishness for the present. In this context, the use of an Elizabethan setting in the Boydell Shakespeare Gallery paintings contributed to the construction of a cultural myth that remains in place today, particularly in Stratford-upon-Avon, but also in other tourist attractions around the country and the world. And this is also linked to the tourist attraction of Shakespeare's Globe that Robbie was talking about before. By the turn of the 19th century, Jacobethan aesthetics had reached the London stage. John Philip Kemble staged a Hamlet around this time that clearly looked back to the period of the playwright's lifetime as its setting, This is Sir Thomas Lawrence's portrait, a very famous portrait of John Philip Kemble as Hamlet. This is the original, and this is an engraving where you can see a little bit more detail of the costume. The portrait depicts the actor-manager wearing a small loose ruff, a small flat hat with a feather trim of an early Elizabethan style, a doublet with a strangely feminine square neckline, short hose, simple leather shoes, and a floor-length fur-edged cloak with sleeves. Nicola J. Watson has argued that Kemble's historically minded Shakespeare productions were part of a conservative political movement to reformulate English cultural identity, along with Walter Scott's novel adaptations of the plays that were around the same time. Watson describes the late 18th century's general interest in historicising Shakespeare as a reassuringly counter-revolutionary or anti-Jacobin cultural strategy developed in the wake of the French Revolution. Stagings of the playwright's work were set in a specific historical period, as well as using what were considered to be genuine versions of Shakespeare's texts and an attempt at original pronunciation. And this was used to promote the playwright's work to the status of actual history and to diffuse contemporary radical politics. So the idealised representation of Elizabethan England that had previously been made popular by the Boydell Shakespeare Gallery was here mobilised to promote a particular political agenda. The sense of patriotic nostalgia engendered by the late 18th century interpretation of Shakespeare's plays and times was used to promote the importance of English tradition and the monarchy at a time of political turmoil in the country. And Kemble's introduction of Jacobean dress in this production seemed to have sparked something of a strange trend in the way that Hamlet was dressed in the decades and almost centuries afterwards. These are all Hamlets staged in the years afterwards, wearing almost identical clothing. And in 1826, there was an edition of the play published where it dictated the exact costume that Hamlet should wear, and it was Kemble's costume, and that's where it came from. And Kemble did continue to play the role in exactly the same costume until he retired in 1817. So we're talking up to 20, 30 years in the same costume, which is not very original. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it. A second wave of Jacobeanism came at the turn of the 20th century and marked the beginning of a revolution in the staging and study of Shakespeare. During the Victorian era, Shakespearean performance had been characterised by a highly elaborate pictorial approach to design. As well as introducing Jacobean aesthetics to the stage, our friend Kemble had also been responsible for bringing in the use of live animals and aquatic effects, which is very strange. The subsequent decades saw many productions along the lines of this one, which was Charles Keane's celebrated 1856 staging of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And this production was set in the Athens of Pericles in a way to find what Shakespeare really wanted, where he really wanted to set his production, supposedly, and featured properties copied from discoveries at Herculaneum as a way of authentically representing this period. And it also included approximately 90 dancing fairies for good measure. Shakespearean staging conventions had become tied to an obsession with accurately representing the settings referred to in the texts, rather than referencing the time of the author or reflecting the context in which the productions were being staged. William Pole sought to find a more authentic Shakespeare by replicating Elizabethan playing practices. The director promoted the belief that Shakespeare should be staged using only those stage appliances and accessories which were usually employed during the Elizabethan period, and he founded the Elizabethan Stage Society to further these principles. In 1893, Pole commissioned the construction of a replica Elizabethan stage space, based partly on the surviving 1599-1600 contract relating to a playhouse called the Fortune, which was constructed around that time. This is from the same collection of papers that the costume inventory was from earlier. And it was also based partially on the DeWitt drawing, which is what we think to be a contemporary drawing of a playhouse, potentially which is also met with a lot of debate. This photograph shows what was he called the Fortune fit-up in use for a production of Measure for Measure. You can see this archway here. This is this with the kind of arras area at the back there was built within an existing performance space as a kind of stage construction and could be moved to other venues and reconstructed. Though the extent to which the performance space adheres to the Fortune contract is questionable, as is the excessive quantity of stage curtains and supposed archaeological exactitude of Elizabethan clothing, the presence of a balcony, recess, and two doors marked a major move away from the established approach to stage design in place at the time. Pole had introduced a new means of representing the time of the author in the design of his productions. Rather than adapting the aesthetic of the past to match the ideals of the present, as had been the case for the Boydell Shakespeare Gallery and John Philip Kemble's Elizabethan Hamlet, Pohl sought to reconstruct the practicalities of early modern performance, to facilitate the author's intentions and to restore the play's original meanings. And Pohl's techniques proved extremely influential. The director's emphasis on the replication of early modern playing conditions inspired an architectural movement of Jacobethanism, which really continues to influence theatre design today, as Robbie was telling us earlier. And Pohl's Fortune Fit-Up went on to inspire the Madder Market Theatre in Norwich from 1921, which was designed by Nugent Monk. Tyrone Guthrie's Open Stage in the Stratford, Ontario Playhouse, still in use today. The Swan Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's Globe, and more recently, the latest incarnation of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon, the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse, and many other theatre spaces around the world. Further, this second wave of Jacobeanism paved the way for directors and designers to seek alternative means of representing the original spirit and intention of Shakespeare's plays in performance. For example, Pohl's innovative methods inspired Barry Jackson to translate the use of the clothing of the day for a 1920s audience. These controversial productions aimed, through the use of modern dress, to make characters more accessible to the audience, better approximating the way in which they would have been understood in their original 16th, 17th century context, as discussed earlier. William Pohl's decision to set his Shakespearean productions in a replica Elizabethan playhouse thus redefined what it meant to represent the period of Shakespeare's lifetime in stage and costume design. The director's approach was catalytic in the development of several approaches to staging the playwright's works that form the basis of Shakespearean performance practice today. Since the 16th century, then, Jacobean aesthetics have proven a malleable and influential element of Shakespearean performance. This approach to design for Shakespeare has been used to promote English nationalism, to diffuse political tensions in the wake of the French Revolution, and as a means of retrieving an authentic Shakespeare. The 1997 opening of Shakespeare's Globe marked the beginning of a third wave of Jacobeanism. As William Pohl reacted against the perceived excesses and irrelevances of the Victorian pictorial Shakespeare, Sam Wanamaker sought to return to a more authentic Shakespeare following a period of performance which had been largely associated with convoluted conceptual theories and directorial interpretations. Authenticity at the Globe has since unravelled, again, as we've heard earlier. The original practices that had underpinned the project's construction, the physical construction, and the early original practices, or authentic practices productions as it was first known, this didn't continue after 2005, and there's since been other troubled elements, I should say, rather than troubling. Other strands of Jacobeanism have since developed at the Globe and across the country. The idealised, nostalgic representation of the Elizabethan period, introduced by the Boydell Shakespeare Gallery and John Philip Kemble, returned to the stage at a time of political turmoil in the UK. While the controversies surrounding the Iraq War gained momentum, the Labour Party lost popularity and later lost power to the Conservatives, and following the resignation of Tony Blair as Prime Minister, the RSC opted to layer Love's Labour's Lost with a glossy, Merry England aesthetic. The figure of Elizabeth I has been used to further particular literary and historical theories. Ruffs and codpieces have been repurposed as a means of exploring gender and equality issues, and Jacobean dress has been reimagined through a 21st century lens to make elements of Shakespeare's plays fantastical or magical for a 21st century audience. The cultural significance of Shakespeare is constantly changing, and so are the ways in which design is used to bridge the gap of time between the past and present. What else has Jacobeanism been made to mean in 21st century Shakespearean performance? And what might this approach to design tell us about our current relationship with Shakespeare, his works, and his era? Thank you.